Okay. So welcome everyone to tonight's public forum. This forum, as you probably know, is about the Thoreau Depot area. And we were fortunate to have our planning division apply for and win a grant with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council to study the Thoreau Depot district with an eye to getting transit-oriented development there. And transit-oriented development is typically kind of a mixed-use, higher density type of development that leverages the transportation resources that are in the area. And so, here we've got the commuter rail, and there have been studies done of the commuter rail stations around Boston, and it is definitely an underutilized resource. That the density of housing and the density of business that could create walkable, sort of movable transit centers really hasn't been leveraged as much as it could be. So when we looked at around Concord, one of the opportunities that was identified in the comprehensive long-range plan was to actually redevelop this area. And so we are using this grant to study what might be possible here, and tonight's public forum is a key part in that process so that you, the public, can give your input on various aspects of the design and how we build this out perhaps someday. Any development would actually be private development, so it would need to be motivated by the people that are there. But what we're trying to do as a planning board is to put in place the right kind of zoning so that the right kind of development could take place. And any zoning initiatives that we did would likely come before town meeting next year, not this year. So that just gives you a little bit of background about where we are in the process, and it's really quite at the beginning here. Yes, if you had a question.
Are we going to be allowed to ask questions, or you want to just wait?
How do you want to do it, Chris?
Yeah, the intent was to provide the feedback either individually among us, so we'll have people floating, or at the stations. I'm happy to take a few sort of clarifying questions at the end of the talk.
Yeah.
I think that makes sense, but I want to sort of be respectful of everybody's time so that people have a chance to provide feedback.
Yeah, so what will happen now is we're going to have a presentation from Chris Kuschel, who is with the MAPC, and then we will afterwards have these different stations, and he'll explain what those stations are for and how we're supposed to use them. So let's get down to work. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me in the back okay? Okay, thanks. Well, first of all, thank you, everybody, for coming out. I know you have plenty of options on what to do on a gloomy night, so I really appreciate you coming out. It's reflective of how much you care about your community to come here and help us plan for this. So the plan is for tonight, I'm going to give a brief presentation, and then we'll break out into these groups, stations that I'll explain a little bit about. I know some of you have already had an opportunity to visit them, but maybe we go to the next slide. Okay, so just to recap, what is the purpose of, what are we doing here as part of this plan? Three things. First, we were trying to come up with a shared vision for this area, the Thoreau Depot area. So what will this place be like over the long term? What do we want it to be like? It's a little bit aspirational. Second, then, is how do we actually achieve it? One of the key ways that we can help achieve the vision is through the zoning. So what we're doing is we're creating a framework. So you're not making anybody build anything. Ultimately, it's the landowner's choice on what to build, but we're communicating what we would like to see built, and we're setting up the conditions to allow that to be built. The zoning, I'll explain in a little bit more detail in a minute or two. It's often one of the biggest hindrances to seeing the type of development that we want, especially around village-like centers. And the zoning's one and probably the most critical aspect, and that's the main focus of this project. But there are other things that the town can be doing to improve and make an area more attractive. So we want to capture that information and write that up as well. Next slide, please. So this project was an outgrowth of your recent master plan that the town completed. This was a 2+ year process, I'm assuming, and it sets your long-term vision town-wide. It sets what are your goals in a whole host of areas. What are the strategies to achieve those goals? Part of the master plan looks at a lot of data, demographic information. I pulled out a few things that I think are sort of relevant here for this planning process. Your population, it's a fair-sized town, 19,000 people. It's been pretty stable. But what has changed, and this is something that we see in a lot of our communities, is the age cohorts within that population are changing. So Concord, like a lot of our communities, is getting older and projected to continue to get older. The 65 plus, the baby boomers, is starting to be a larger percentage of the population. And that has implications for what is the type of housing that people who want to remain in their town, what do they need? What are the needs of the elderly, the older populations? For an example, the school-age population is about 1/5 of your population, and that has and is projected to remain relatively flat. This is also something that we see in lots of communities. People are waiting longer to have children, and they're having fewer numbers of children. Most people who work in Concord come from outside of Concord. This probably isn't a big surprise. Concord's an expensive place to live. And that was one of the things that came out of the master plan is one of the concerns among a large segment of the homeowners is the high cost of housing and the taxes. The master plan also has then a number of goals, some of which are very specific, so of place-based. So one of them, it was explicitly to look at your village centers, such as Thoreau Depot area, make it more inviting, facilitate the types of uses and the type of development that is more in keeping with a traditional sort of New England downtown. There are other sort of more general recommendations, such as supporting commercial businesses, creating housing for a range of incomes. So where do we tend to want to do that? Well, one of the ways you create more affordable housing is by having smaller homes, and that tends to be in a place like around a downtown as part of a mixed-use environment. So all of these things were actually what led directly to the town applying for the grant to help implement some of the recommendations from the master plan by focusing on this area. So if the master plan's your 30,000 foot view, this is maybe a 15,000 foot view. So we're still looking fairly high level, but we're getting a little bit closer to the ground. Thank you. This is the area for people who have been walking around and seeing the station. So this is obviously a diagram of the existing conditions today. Just to orient you, you can see on the bottom right is where the Crosby Market is. The north-south is tilted a little bit just for the sake of the picture. Sudbury Road is the one that's going up-down. Left-right is where Thoreau Street is, and you can see where the T is identified. So this area, it's actually fairly small. So it's 28 parcels spread over 15 acres. Just to give a sense, I'm working on a project that I just completed in Woburn that was looking at one single parcel, the old Woburn Mall, which is being redeveloped. That's 23 acres. So here we have a whole neighborhood that's smaller than this one parcel. And then the amount of building that you have there is reflective of that. 200,000 square feet is not a huge amount of development there today. Most of the area is impervious, which is probably what you would expect. Next slide. So one of the things we need to look at is what is there today? What is the existing land use? All that yellow surrounding this area, that is all residential, mostly single-family residences that bounds and surrounds this little commercial cluster. The red, which is most of it, the slide's a little, I think the screen color is a little washed out, but most of this area is red. That is commercial uses. You have a little bit, one parcel and one building within that parcel that is actually a mixed-use building. And to clarify, when I say mixed-use building, what I tend to mean is having restaurants or retail or other commercial space on the ground floor than with people living above it. What we're starting to see now more and more within our downtowns throughout our region is That red is shifting to orange. So orange is mixed use. So that's where there might be an opportunity here. Next slide, please. So land use is what's there today. Zoning is what helps tell you what you're allowed to build and what your obligations are if you decide to build on your property. This study area is one specific district, which actually makes things a little bit easier, called the Thoreau Business District. If you go to the next slide, please. I won't read all of this, but one of the real important things as part of our work is we need to understand what the existing regulations are and then compare that to what people say that they actually want and then make changes as necessary. So a couple of the takeaways that we have from our initial scan of the zoning was it's very flexible in terms of what you're allowed to build there. You're able to build almost anything. Which on the one hand is good. On the other hand, maybe it's a little too flexible. So do you really want to allow industrial uses in an area that is like a village-like setting as you can today? MAPC, we are huge proponents of increasing the amount of affordable housing, both naturally occurring as well as deed-restricted affordable housing. But maybe in this case, it's a little too high of a percentage and might be a little too onerous, and that could result in not having any development at all, which is, I would say, even worse. Another really key thing that we look at is what is the amount of parking that is required. Often what we found, and we've done many studies to look at this, is that communities require too much parking. It's actually underutilized. All that parking, it costs a lot of money to actually create, and it's essentially ends up being wasted space in a lot of cases. And it really hinders the walkable characteristics that a lot of communities want for their downtowns. We also look at the dimensional standards. So what are the heights that you are required, which actually is appropriate already probably today in that area. What are the setbacks? So how far away from the sidewalk does a building need to be? So a lot of that in this case is actually quite good already. So we'll probably be looking at some other things. Next slide. Few other things that we have looked at as a first part is existing conditions. What are the building heights in this area? Most of it, and again, this is a little bit washed out, but most of it is the light blue. It's our single-story buildings. This tends to suggest that a lot of this area is a little bit underutilized because if you have single-story buildings that's commercial, that could be an opportunity to build above that another story or two of whether it's residences or offices or other types of uses. There's one 3-story building in the area. Thank you. Floor area ratio is it's another measure of density. Frankly, it's an imperfect measure of density, but it helps give a sense for how dense this area is and whether it's potentially a little bit underutilized. So the lowest density areas are the lightest colors. So for example, the area where the Crosby's Market is, that's a low density building. It's single story with a ton of parking. Conversely, when you look up on Thoreau Street, near the top left, those are also single-story buildings, but because they occupy most of the lot, they're actually fairly high density, at least from a relative perspective. I think the key takeaway is this is a very low dense area, and generally when you want to sort of instill a vibrant mixed-use neighborhood, you tend to see things be a little bit more denser in our New England downtowns. We also took a first pass, again, as consultants and from some initial conversations. What are some of the strengths in this area? What are some of the challenges? So I mentioned some of these already. So some aspects of the zoning are actually pretty strong, which is great. You're close to your own downtown area, fairly close. You have some interesting and distinct buildings today that we want to sort of foster and enhance those, most likely. You have sidewalks throughout a lot of this area, which is good from a walkability perspective. Having the commuter rail station is one of the key drivers of demand. Even though you're a 45-minute commuter rail ride from Boston, that might sound kind of far, that's actually, as far as Newburyport or even farther, we're seeing huge demand all because of the train access. So it's a huge opportunity and asset that the town has. You also have a variety of businesses. You have already one mixed-use development in the area that you can sort of build on. And one of the things that I always hear in these projects is we would love to have a grocery store. You already have one, so maybe you keep the grocery store, but maybe there's a way to reorganize the development to keep the asset, but also builds upon that. Next slide, thank you. So some of the challenges. Well, the zoning is certainly not perfect. I think what my guess is, that based upon what I hear tonight throughout the stations, there's going to be a lot of opportunity to improve upon the existing regulations. There are a number of sites that are very, what I would call auto-centric, and that can be a hindrance for enhancing both the walkability of an area and how safe an area is for pedestrians, including challenging intersections, which I've already heard from a number of people about. There are areas that are lacking sidewalks on both sides or have excessive curb cuts. So again, that just makes it a little bit less safe and less walkable for people. And then because you do have so many single-story buildings, there is an opportunity where maybe some of those could go up a little bit and be a little bit taller and encourage a little bit more development. So that was a brief overview. My email is up there, so people feel free to call me or email me. My colleague, Ella, I put her contact info as well, but also Elizabeth Hughes, who is the town planner. I put her contact information as well, so feel free to contact any of us. Now, I know a number of you were already here a little bit early, and so you've had a chance to browse around. We have, I think, 4 different stations right now between these 2 rooms. The members of the planning board will be at each station to help facilitate and help gather information. So we have, in that back corner, there is a station related to the commercial and retail needs. So it's an opportunity for you to provide your feedback on what would enhance the businesses of this area. In that room, we have what's called a visual preference survey. So that's where you can actually help us determine what is the type of development that you would like to see. Again, this isn't a specific project, but what's the types of buildings, what's the scale, what are the uses that you would like to see in this area. And then we have what I'm calling connectivity. It's basically how do you get around, what would improve that, especially from a pedestrian perspective, but also for cars traveling into the area. I'm happy to take a couple questions now. I'm just going to give, I see in the back, about 5 minutes of this, and then I want to sort of be respectful of everyone's time, and then we'll break out. And then I'll be floating around, and I'm happy to talk more one-on-one with others. Yes?
I just want to clarify, is the primary purpose of this for zoning, to kind of form a plan on zoning so it puts a kind of confinement into what we're able to do? Is that it? Because I don't understand how there's so much of the property is already owned by property management, different companies and different holding companies. So our purpose to define the zoning and vote on that and then give it to the property management so they can do what they want within those confines? Or what is our purpose?
Yes, so I'd say the purpose is, again, threefold. First, it's to come up with the vision. So the first step is, as a community, what would you like to see? Then how do we implement that? So again, we can't make a property owner redevelop. You're absolutely right. All we can do is set the conditions to communicate A, what we want, and B, allow that to actually take place. Because right now, chances are what you actually would like to see can't even take place. So again, it's not forcing a business owner to do anything. We can't make him do anything or her do anything. We can set the framework to allow that. And then right behind you.
You said that most of this is one story, okay? Is there anything in the current zoning that keeps an owner from putting a second story on?
No, they can build higher today.
Okay, so why would you need then to change the zoning if they can do it today?
The heights are only one aspect. There are a number of things that help determine whether something is feasible. So parking might be another one. The requirements for affordable housing could be another as well. So the heights, I think, are probably appropriate. I'm going to guess you're not going to want to go higher probably than what you have today, but maybe some people do want to, and we'll gather that feedback. Maybe some parts of the neighborhood could be higher than 35 feet if that's what people want. So there's a number of, I think, areas that the zoning could be improved to help induce redevelopment. All right, and I saw your hand was early.
Question about parking. Could you or Elizabeth, somebody clarify? It looks like there's oodles and oodles of parking in Crosby's, and yet that's not really true because some of that is commuter parking. I don't know whether that's on lease or what exactly that is, but that parking is used by commuters
Yeah.
now.
So goes over to residential.
Marsha, do you want to?
That goes back to the 1950s when the Zoning Board of Appeals approved a special permit to allow the grocery store to go in there. And part of the negotiations included reservation of 50 parking spaces for commuters. And so after they made some improvements to that parking lot and placed a conservation, they were supposed to put a conservation restriction on a portion of the property, they found that they couldn't dump the snow in the grass strip any longer, and so there were some issues. So they came to the planning board, or came to the town manager's office rather, and I've been negotiating with the owners of the property to provide for different types of commuter parking spaces in that location. So they're by placard or by, right now they're by placard, and we have some that go to Yankee Bus, so that's how it's being used right now. I know they are underutilized, and so we're exploring some other options.
Okay, I'll take two more questions. It's in the back, and then I'll go to you after. Yes,
Back
ma'am.
to the zoning issue, we're going to be talking about zoning changes to the business district only, not the residential?
Correct, yes.
And what's the difference, I'm curious, maybe as other people are, the difference between the two different residential zones?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, sure.
So, most of the housing nearby is Residence C. That's quarter-acre zoning. So quarter-acre lots are conforming. The area where you head up Sudbury Road is Residence B. That's half-acre zoning. And there are different setbacks and other details, but that's the most fundamental difference.
Okay, and then, sir.
It sounds like it's, you're trying to increase the density and congestion and everything else, and the population is going to increase. And I think, the gentleman over here expressed a problem with parking and traffic coming through. We live on Grant Street and it's now cut through. And if we start increasing the business, it's going to increase the traffic. And one of the reasons we moved here a long time ago was to get out of places that were congested. And I think it would be a bad idea to change that. By all means, make it more pedestrian and lovely, but I think to sort of change the nature of the town, which it could do, would be a bit interesting.
Yeah, and I think, I'm not going to speak to the specifics because, again, I think we're going to have a whole range of opinions about that. But I know in the master plan, one of the things was to maintain the character. So I think that is always going to be something that is as part of this, and it's a challenge to accomplish that with development, but there are ways to develop in a context-sensitive manner. So with that, I'll be floating around. I'm happy to talk more with anybody. Marsha, Elizabeth are also around, or feel free to engage any of the planning board members. So thanks again for coming tonight, and we look forward to seeing all the feedback.